In the name of God, the most merciful, most compassionate. Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to this session. This session is on Gulf reconciliation and relations with Iran. This is a very important topic, of course, to any GCC citizen or people who are concerned with the issues concerning this area. Iran is a strong regional power, and the Gulf relations with Iran are not on the same level or equal footing as when we discuss political security or other issues. Iran does not deal with the GCC countries as a bloc. It deals with each country individually, and since Iran embarked on its regional project in 1979, Iran keeps on expanding, and there is an Iranian project, but there is no Gulf project. So therefore, Iran is more or less, Iran comes on top every time. For this session, we have three experts. We will start first with Dr. Mohammed Al-Mesfer. He needs no introductions. He is a university professor, as an academic, and a former diplomat. I'll start with Dr. Mohammed. You have 15 minutes, please. The floor is yours. Thank you, Chair. And I would like to thank the organizers for putting us in this position. Big hall immediately after lunch. Everybody feels like having a siesta, but I hope nonetheless we will manage to do something useful in this meeting, and I have no doubt and no disagreement that Iran, or the Islamic Republic of Iran, occupies an important position because of its population, geographical location, and the abundance of natural resources. I'm not going to talk about the political aspect of Gulf countries' relations with Iran, nor will I allude to the historical aspect, which has always been problematic. I thought it's best to immediately get into the bit when Ibrahim Raisi became president on the 5th of August 2021. I will not talk about his biography. Since the 1979 revolution, there has been a lot of controversy about the person of the president inside Iran. Iran's foreign policy is known to be divided between different centers of power. In fact, since the emancipation of Iran, as called, and the Islamic Revolution, has led to many confrontations with countries, and in particular the Arab Gulf countries. There are two schools when it comes to Iran's foreign policy. One is a regional one, where the followers of this school of thought think as the immediate neighbors of Iran should be the focus, and the followers of this school of thought think that achieving Iran's long-term objectives in way for them is doing that will enhance Iran's position vis-à-vis the major powers, especially the United States and the European community. Ibrahim Raisi belongs to this school of regional focus, and we have good examples from Iraq, Afghanistan, Azerbaijan, Yemen, and other countries neighboring Iran. The second school sees that solving Iran's problems inside and outside, or in reaching any understanding with the United States and the European community, this should take priority, and if achieved, will have a positive impact on Iran's regional relations. And I remember that the Shah of Iran that used to see that Iran's relations with the Europeans and also with the United States, who adopted him as the policeman of the region, that the followers of this school see that it's better in Iran's future and for present and futures to be closer to these powers. As for the geographic proximity, both schools see the Arab countries, or the Gulf countries in particular, lack independence when it comes to charting their foreign policy. So therefore, they sometimes invite them to engage in negotiations, and on other occasions with military exercises or testing missiles and drones, etc. And sometimes also by flexing the muscles of the Revolutionary Guards or the armed forces, or holding maneuvers in the Gulf waters, and sometimes this takes the shape of attacks on oil tankers, as we have seen in the previous months. How many incidents like that took place before the very eyes of the United States. And sometimes there are some frictions with the American forces in the Gulf or the other water lanes. Of course, in Iran there is the Supreme Council for National Security, which is the highest authority, which is headed by the President himself, Ibrahim Raisi, and it has the Foreign Minister, Interior Minister, and Information Minister in its membership, and the commanders of the armed forces, and deputy representing the supreme leader, and also both the parliament and the other state institutions play a role. Mr. Ibrahim Raisi has said on more than one occasion that his foreign policy focuses on the region rather than the international powers, without, of course, ignoring the 5+1 negotiations on the nuclear deal. And he also repeatedly said that the area, the region, and the Muslim world is the focus of his attention, and any success in that will achieve for Iran the stability it aims for. And I start with Afghanistan first. Iran has some 940, 950 kilometers long borders with Afghanistan, and they have more than 900,000 legal immigrants, and there are between 2 to 4, some say 3 million Afghanis who are illegal immigrants inside Iran. Iran thinks that this number of Afghanis inside its territory are a source of threat to security. This is not true. Iran has used these who are by and large Shiites who follow Iran in their religious beliefs. Iran has recruited many of them to fight in Syria and others, like the Brigade of Fatimiyun and Zainabiyun from Pakistani Shiites who were trained by the leaders of the Revolutionary Guard since 2012. So, therefore, on the face of it, there's nothing to make Iran feel concerned about it. And Iran used these militias also as a way of leverage against the Taliban before coming to power and after coming to power, when and of course in the past there was an incident when the Iranian consulate was attacked and the situation got almost out of hand at the time. Of course, Russia is a neighbor of Iran, and last October there was a conference arranged that Taliban, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, Pakistan, China, and India were all invited. There are other neighbors or close neighbors of Afghanistan. This conference did not produce much results apart from a call on Iran to open up to Afghanistan. The Iranians consider that this conference did not achieve its objectives, the objectives that Iran aspired to. For this reason, another conference was arranged about a week later. China, Turkmenistan, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, Russia attended, and the agenda discussed the formation of a comprehensive, inclusive government in Afghanistan, although the Taliban government itself was not invited, which reflects some concern by Iran. Also, of course, the Afghanis also felt sensitive that the same people who were invited to Moscow before were invited to Tehran, but this time round excluded the Taliban. About Iraq, I will not revisit history. This very moment, everybody is witnessing what's happening in Iraq. The result of the latest elections in Iraq was a total failure for the Iranian-backed militias. When the Iranians felt that, they sent the commander of the Al-Quds Brigade, Ismail Qa'ani, and the Iraqis called it the secret visit under the cover of darkness. This is what the Iraqis thought of Qa'ani's visit, because he tried to bring together all those supporters of Iran who failed in the elections to reorganize themselves. After that meeting, the powers supported by Iran forced the hand of the authorities to recount the votes, and if this happens, this may take Iraq into another round of chaos which may last for a long time. Iran is doing its best to absorb the failure of its allies through forming a parliamentary bloc under the guise of a coordination committee with the membership of all these different entities to form a single bloc in the parliament to face up to the Sadrist uh, trend who won the elections, and debate still goes on what the final result would be because of all the objections raised against the results and the calls for recounts. Some have even threatened to leave the political process, which can only mean resorting to using force to regain power. Syria is now under the umbrella of Iran, and all the attempts by the Arab countries to restore the situation and to restore Syria back into the Arab fold is doomed to failure because this is impossible. Now, the Iranian units in Iran are part and parcel of the regime and its forces, so therefore anybody who is banking on the return of Bashar al-Assad to the Arab fold are placing their bets on a losing horse. In Yemen, the Iranians did everything to support the Houthis in deposing the legitimate government, and since Raisi came to power, the battles are waging in Ma'rib, and this is the same school which says that achieving zero problems with Iran and the region so that Iran can focus all its attentions on its relations with the international bodies and countries, and if Iran succeeds, then Saudi Arabia will find itself squeezed between a rock and a hard place. Saudi Arabia could not achieve anything in the south, so if another front is open in the east, then it will be impossible for Saudi Arabia. The latest reports say that 15 drones have attacked strategic targets inside Saudi Arabia. With all my due respect, Yemeni people, if given the resources, they can do better than that. But I don't think, under the current circumstances, can manage to produce 15 drones and launch them simultaneously to attack multiple targets inside Saudi Arabia without outside help. I think all the fingers of blame should be pointing towards Iran. Can the Houthis are the Houthis really able to manufacture all these drones and target them? I think there is someone behind them who's doing that. This is another myth, similarly to thinking that Bashar al-Assad can return to the Arab fold. Also, the ones who think that Israel are a deterrent to Iran, they are deluding themselves. They will fall victim to their own illusions. Once Israel manages to get all the information it needs on the ruling elite in the Gulf and their inner struggles, the entire region will be captive to Israel. They'll be hostages to Israel. Now that they've exposed themselves, the Israelis now can expose all their scandals. If these elites think that using Israeli methods and tools of spying, this will protect them from Israel, they are deluding themselves. For Israelis, all the Arabs are the same, and this will not protect the Gulf elites. Finally, I remind you what Franklin Benjamin said. He is a hero of liberation in a meeting in Philadelphia in 1789, that there is a big risk facing the United States, who are the Jews, because in every land they settled, they lowered the level of ethics and morality. So therefore, I invite you to throw them out of the country, because if they remain, they will constitute a threat, because simply by concentrating in any country, they will work on destroying the traditions and the ethical standards of any society, and they manage to gain control over the country financially and economically. Uh, Therefore, as we see, this talk about investments is open to many interpretations, and maybe the root causes of the 2017 crisis is another matter we can revisit. Thank you, Dr. Mohammed. You were very brief and concise. I give the floor now to Dr. Mahjoob, who is an academic from the University of Qatar. He's director of Gulf Studies program. Please, the floor is yours. You have 15 minutes.
Thank you very much, Dr. Abdullah. First of all, allow me to extend my thanks to my colleagues at Al Arabi Center for their kind invitation to participate and take part in this edition of the forum. Talking about Iran and GCC countries, this topic pushes me all the time to put things in context. And as people of the jurisprudence say, the jurists say, we have to consolidate things, to set them in context, to understand the dynamism of the Arabo-Iranian relationship. And in the light of what has happened in 2017, this leads us to a basic question: what has Iran gained from the GCC crisis? And what has it gained as a result of the blockade that was imposed on the state of Qatar? And there is another question that follows. So what has Iran lost as a result of the Ula agreement? To understand these two questions, we have to go back to 1990. During the invasion, Iran said something diplomatically that was repeated by Rafsanjani and other politicians who said that Iran is not going to allow the change of geography in the region, and it stood with the United States of America, its traditional enemy, and also with the allied states, and it said that it did not want Saddam Hussein to change the geographical relationship or reality. The same position was underlined in 2017 in the meeting that took place in Turkey between the Iranian and Jawad Zarif and his counterpart in Turkey. Zarif said that he does not want the strategic geographical perspectives to be changed in the region. What does that mean for the GCC countries? And what does it mean? What has Iran understood from that? So this is something that was underlined by Iran in 1990, and it was repeated. It kept on saying, I am the bad guy in the neighborhood that leads to instability in the region, and I'm telling you, I've never been that bad guy. The bad guy is amongst you, is between you. It used to be Saddam Hussein, and now look, there are 3 GCC countries putting another GCC country under siege. So the problem lies within you. So this sentence is very, very important indeed because it liberates Iran from the stigma that used to be on Iran, that it is the one that destroys everything. So those who destabilize the region are those countries. Tell me, how many times have I destabilized the region? And there is another narrative that we know because we follow what is taking place on the ground. So this is the narrative that Iran uses in order for it to benefit from the 2017 blockade and also the economic benefit by allowing the Qatari aircrafts to use its airspace and so on and so forth. Despite the special relationship between Syria and Iran and the economic relationship is very low, but even in the relationship with Qatar, it was not able to reinforce its economic relationship. This shows that Iran was not able to remove those issues and problematics that lie in the relationship between Iran and the GCC countries, although it kept on underlining that narrative. So what did Al-Ula agreement mean for Iran? Al-Ula agreement meant a temporary reconciliation. The rifts remain. The level of openness is not going to be with all blockading countries at the same level. So there is a kind of selectiveness at the level of reconciliation. And Iran announced at the time that it was going to continue, and I here underline continue in its dialogue with Saudi. To say what? To say that the dialogue with Saudi started even before Al-Ula agreement, and that Al-Ula agreement was not the catalyst for the reconciliation. The timing of talks about reconciliation, talks about negotiation, talks about rapprochement is also very, very important in terms of timing. The second component in this narrative of Iran vis-a-vis the GCC. So Iran, the first message was, we are not the bad guys. The second message is that Iran is keen to have a strategy, keen to infiltrate the GCC. Iran does not want to have excellent relations with all GCC countries. No, to have a good relationship with Qatar and Saudi Arabia and Bahrain, that should be enough. To have bad relations with the Emirates is enough for it. This third component of the Iranian strategy has not changed in actual fact since 1990, and I call it the strategy where it infiltrated the GCC, which means that it was able to have a presence at the level of the GCC. We cannot generalize and say that Iran constitutes a problem for all the GCC. It can deny it and say, look, I have good relations with this country, with that country, so it doesn't mean that my relationship with the whole GCC is bad. So it responds to this narrative through this strategy. So this is the third component that I talked about. So how does Iran deal with the GCC? So this is a very important component. So what has changed in recent months, which had impacts on the GCC? There are three variables that came at a timing that was not wanted by Iran. So Iran was able to intervene depending on its own will, and it was able to reuse these incidents to its favor, to its benefit. There are some recent events, and they were quick attacks when Taliban controlled Kabul, and also the confrontation with Azerbaijan and the results of the Iraqi elections. So these are three kind of hits, irrespective of its control, they came surprising. So it had talks with Pakistan and also to Doha. It received a clear message from Moscow saying that we are not going to accept what you might do in the Afghan street. So also the doctors who are overseeing the COVID pandemic and these personalities in Afghanistan, these and I would like to repeat that the personalities that are in Afghanistan are not necessarily Shiite, and the Afghanistan battle also led to a controversy and the problematic when it comes to the elections in Iraq. I would like to add to what Dr. Mesfer had said. It led to a new dynamic and in the light of this hesitation and the lack of consensus in the JCPOA, so Iran cannot deal with the crisis in all animosity with Iraq because it does not want those who doubt Iran to be against Iran. So there have been secret visits from Iranians by Iranians to Baghdad. They said we do not want a confrontation. We just want to know that this government is not going to be enemy to Iran. So these are three developments. What is the impact on what is happening in the GCC? So these incidents have led to so many problematics for Iran. So at this particular time, Saudi Arabia changed the way it talked. So there were statements by Saudi Arabia. They said that Iran was not serious in the talks, and there are other statements that said that the international community should talk about the missile program of Iran and the sabotaging effects. So what does that mean? The results of Iraqi elections have impacted the discussions between Saudi Arabia and Iran. So Saudi Arabia was following what was happening in Iraq, and this impacted its talk with Iran. Also, the control of Taliban, the control of Afghanistan also impacted relations, although that there are doubts that there might be some good relationship with Pakistan. This came with a kind of Pakistani-Saudi openness, and this annoys Iran because they do not want Saudi Arabia to go back to the region through Pakistan. So the other matter that I would like to talk about after we got to know these quick-paced dynamics, where is the United States of America? The United States of America, as far as the former head of the intelligence unit, this is something that I heard from him. This was not a statement. No, John Brennan who said that. So the director of the former CIS, the former director of the CIS, and he said this is a hesitant department, hesitant administration. And when we talked about Iran, the administration benefited from what was left by Donald Trump. So they found that sanctions have really undermined and affected Iran a lot. And this has led to the fact that they continue with the sanction strategy. So let me remind you of what it has done when Donald Trump withdrew from the agreement in 2018 and when he imposed strict sanctions on Iran. 8.3 million of the middle class, which is the most important group. So these people, 8.3, became poor and they moved to the periphery as a result of the sanctions that have been imposed by the Trump administration. And the Biden administration realized that these sanctions were important and they thought about postponing the negotiations. And Saudi Arabia incites for such an end, and their intentions are not good enough, as Iran thinks. So Iran thinks if the relationship between Saudi Arabia and the US is not good, this is going to be in the interest of Iran. So in conclusion, there is a new American administration and there is a new Iranian president who is going to complete his first 6 months in office. So the new president bets on a better economy, and a better economy can only be achieved through the lifting of the sanctions that are imposed. So there are a number of dossiers in the east, in the north, and even with the west and its relationship with Iraq, and this is not going to help Iran economically. And staying outside the oil market, even if the sanctions are lifted, this is not going to be helpful because the level of harm would need 2 decades to restructure the economy. And the second reason is that the new openness on the world is based on change of ideas, which is based on investment and also cultural invasion. And the political regime fears a cultural invasion if they open up economically. And this is going to make Iran hesitate, and it would make it fear being impacted economically. And may the peace and blessings of God be upon you all. Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Mahjoob. Thank you for shining light on the relationship between Iran and the GCC, although there are reservations between on the second part, because there's no unified policy from the GCC towards Iran. I would like to move to the third speaker, Mr. Robert Mason. So he's going to talk about, he's from Washington, and he's going to talk about Saudi-Iranian talks on track to de-escalation in the Middle East. The floor is yours, sir. So we can see you. They told me at the beginning that we're not going to be able to see him, just to hear him, but it's good that we can see him now as well. So he's going to speak in English. And Mr. Robert, can you hear us? The moderator is asking you.
Hello.
Thank you very much. Yeah, can you hear me?
Well, fine. You can carry on, please.
Okay, thank you. Okay. I'm actually based in Cairo, so if there's a problem with the signal, I'll have to switch off the camera, but I'll try it as we are. So thank you very much to yourselves, my esteemed colleagues, and to the organisers of the 8 Gulf Studies Forum. My talk today is entitled "The Saudi-Iranian Talks on Track to De-escalation in the Middle East." And I think it's worth perhaps talking a little bit about history of the bilateral relationship, first of all, just very briefly. It's obviously mainly on sectarian animosity, both internally and externally, competition for leadership of the Muslim world, diverse political systems, including monarchy on the KSA side and republic on the Iranian side, and their different national capabilities, which has caused an unevenness to their interactions and imbalance of power regionally. Their limited sources of soft power influence, and of course the inclusion of the US along with Saudi Arabia, who have both been engaged in rolling back Iranian influence and alliances through US containment policies and Saudi realpolitik, and of course Iranian reliance on violent non-state actors. These relations have been aggravated by US intervention of Iraq in 2003, and of course the Arab uprisings from 2011.
غزو العراق وكذلك عفوا قطع الصوت نعتذر لمن يستمع الترجمة.
There's been a series of periods of tension, both the Iran-Iraq war, for example, demonstrations and incidents during the Hajj, which are numerous, and more recently US-Iran tensions from 2019 to 2021. But that is not to say that there haven't been periods of positive interaction. 1996 to 2002, for example, included. So there are periods where there's been both personal connectivity, high-level visits, but also the conceptualization of the regional security environments in very similar ways. And more recently, the nuclear diplomacy being dominated by external powers, and then back to sectarian issues after the execution of Nimr al-Nimr in 2016. So why diplomacy? First of all, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia launched Vision 2030 in 2016, which requires regional stability as a prerequisite. There's the ongoing Yemen war as a consideration, reputational damage, and over-reliance perhaps on US security guarantees, particularly during the rocket and missile attacks in 2019. But there's also been this changing role of Islam, whereby I think there's perhaps been a narrowing of Islam in the kingdom, focusing more on political legitimacy and tourism, and less interest in exporting Wahhabi tenets internationally. On the Iranian side, there's IRGC consolidation taking place, sanctions which have been crippling the economy, and therefore sanctions relief is a priority. So very much focused on economic issues, driving this diplomacy which has been taking place since April 2021. And perhaps COVID-19 being also an issue for Iran as it seeks to address economic and health issues. But on top of that, there's US policy considerations, and these have also been somewhat changeable. So there's dual containment, for example, that's taken place after the Gulf War. There's opportunities for outreach with Iran, which have been rejected. There's maximum pressure policies during the Trump administration, which has caused significant tensions. And of course, US withdrawal from the JCPA in 2018. Now, that policy has been somewhat changed under the Biden administration, but there's still issues perhaps in whether there's going to be a return to the JCPOA with Iran, and how the temporary offensive arms sales to Saudi Arabia is affecting its threat perception in the region, particularly in 2021 as Thad and US troops were withdrawn from the kingdom. And I think there's also been a questioning from the allied side of the US as to how US policy will change towards allies after the Afghan withdrawal. I think it's perhaps worth dwelling on the JCPOA as a perhaps missed opportunity for extending diplomacy in 2015, because whilst there is a UK recognition that the JCPOA could not be improved upon, it could not have been broadened out, some, such as Ambassador Westfall, the former US ambassador to the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia from 2014 to 2017, said that agreement could have been broadened out, that it could have included things like Yemen, particularly stopping the fighting and achieving a broader peace agreement. He says, of course, it's absolutely a tough sell to achieve that, but I think the Obama administration could have explored perhaps further opportunities to improve on the nuclear deal into areas of regional security. And the next step, of course, after the JCPOA deal, if it hadn't been affected by US withdrawal in 2018, could have been an OSCE type style forum, focusing on regional parties and their inclusion in dialogue on regional security issues. Turkey, Israel, Palestine, even India and Pakistan could have been included in this and still could be going forward. Attention could have been focused more earlier on in terms of defeating ISIS, but instead we've been focused on the JCPOA for many years now. So it really relies fundamentally, this dialogue, on the US returning back to the JCPOA and then on other non-nuclear issues being managed in other ways. What are the prospects then for Saudi-Iranian relations going forward? I think there can be improvements to the Hajj. There can be a normalization of relations, that is to say, a focus on re-establishing diplomatic contacts on more of a pragmatic basis for their interactions. But as Nazareth says, the development challenges of each country will play into sectarian discourse. So if these vision targets in the kingdom and elsewhere in the GCC are not achieved as they wish to be achieved, it may be difficult to advance a sustainable course of action in terms of diplomacy with Iran. And the Gulf states and Iran have both been opposing sides in places like Syria, for example. There's no common ground at all. So it's very difficult beyond Yemen, for example, to achieve a working relationship. The leaders also appear to be mismatched. We have Mohammed bin Nayef, for example, working with Rafsanjani in the 1990s, albeit under much lower threat perception. But the political consolidation taking place today in both states perhaps makes it more difficult to achieve a balanced, pragmatic relationship. And there's many fundamental issues. The naming of the Gulf, for example, sources of political legitimacy, concurrent shifts in US-Iran relations, particularly concerning the JCPOA, addressing internal and external sectarianism, building tolerance, extending work to how the media portrays the relationship, all really requires a new normative approach. And of course, resolving deadlocks, conflicts in places like Syria and Yemen. Yemen is an interesting case because it's what's been called a freestanding issue by Sir William Patey, a former UK ambassador to Saudi Arabia. Iran has no strategic interest in Yemen, so there could be concessions here. Yemen is an embarrassment on the humanitarian situation, but it's also a Saudi strategic priority. There's no advance on diplomacy in Yemen until Marib is secured, and Iran won't move on other issues such as Lebanon and Iraq, although Saudi Arabia is increasing its influence here, and Syria, where the Emirates is also increasing its influence with Syria with a view to Iran perhaps. But as I say, Yemen is a possibility, and I think Iraq is also an interesting case where it's increasingly balancing its relations with the kingdom and also Iran. So it could in fact be a blueprint for more balanced and pragmatic relationships going forward. What are the wider lessons for dialogue between Saudi Arabia and Iran? Well, certainly the relationships have been highly personalized over the years. There's pragmatism and reciprocity, which usually work, and it benefits both states to engage in that. And that's something I've argued for in the past. The Saudi has a limited window to diversify, and therefore it's in both states' economic interest to come to an understanding, if you like, although there's still much work to be done. A lack of progress has multifarious consequences, not only for Gulf security, but across the region and internationally. And I think it's perhaps important to consider this idea of broadening regional security architecture, it being considered a dynamic issue, but certainly rooted in UN Security Council 598, which gives the United Nations Secretary General a mandate to begin a dialogue on regional cooperation. So there's many different models which could be drawn upon, and there's certainly an ability to include the UN in this going forward. And there's also confidence building measures, I think, which can tackle this legacy of mistrust, this long history of mistrust and lack of communication. I look forward to addressing the other issues, perhaps in this bilateral relationship in the Q&A. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Robert.
شكرا لك Robert. Once again, I thank the panelists. And before we open the floor to your questions, I just want to add 3 points which I think are important so far as Yemen is concerned. First of all, we must realize that Iran is going ahead with its own project with a clear sense of direction and a compass which guides it in charting its future plans. And in return, the Gulf countries have no such thing. Secondly, the Iranian project is very pragmatic. It has no moral dimension at all. Iran makes good use of the situation and the realities. Iran did not occupy Iraq, but made the best of American occupation of it. Iran did not create the Houthis. The Houthis existed before that, but they utilized the Houthis to its own ends. So the Iranian project is very pragmatic. Also, the Iranians are known to be very patient. They have long-term planning, whereas we in the Gulf do not. Now we open the floor. If you have any questions, please raise your hand. Let me just take a simple count of those who wish to ask questions. Dr. Bakil, you can start. Thank you all for your valuable contributions. My name is Bakir Zindani from Qatar University. 2 questions, one to Dr. Al-Mesfer and one to Dr. Mahjoob. Dr. Mohammed Al-Mesfer, you spoke about the Russian presence. This Russian presence in Syria, for example, will it provide an alternative to Iran or complementing the role of Iran? Dr. Mahjoob, you said 8.6 or 6.8 million middle class who have now become poor. Can Iran, with this sense of direction in the area, in the region, Iran, can it sustain its presence with all its internal problems, with its expansion in Yemen, Iraq, Syria, and others? And do the Americans prefer that to any other approach? Assalamu alaikum, Dr. Firas Elias from Iraq. I have a question to Dr. Mohammed Al-Mesfer. How do you see the dichotomy of the state and the revolution with the arrival of Ibrahim Raisi to power? Will the pragmatic side take over now? Or I have a comment also to make what Dr. Mohammed Mesfer said, Dr. Mahjoob, when they talked about Iran and Iraq and the loss of Iran's allies in the recent elections. In fact, there is no one single unified Iranian voice. There are different. There is one for the Revolutionary Guard, there is one for the Iranian intelligence, there is one also for other militias. And this division came into existence after the assassination of Qasem Soleimani, who had the kind of relations and charisma, and he had good contacts with the Shiites, Sunnis, and Kurds. After his assassination and the failure of Qa'ani to fill the gap he left behind, this allowed for other Iranian institutions to get involved, like the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the security apparatus. For example, the Iranian Foreign Ministry welcomed the results of the elections, although the Revolutionary Guards expressed fear because they think that any loss at this level will lead to political loss, and they want to secure the land route from Tehran to the Mediterranean. They don't want that project to be jeopardized. Also, the Iranians are trying to stop the Kurds and the Sunnis providing support to Muqtada al-Sadr, because this can place Iran in a strategic dilemma and impact its influence in the future. And also, if, I think the postponement of the fifth round of dialogue between Saudi Arabia and Iran reflects that the kind of ambiguity surrounding the political scene in Iraq now does not allow either country to decide what to do. They don't know the future government in Iraq, whether it will be closer to Iran or Saudi Arabia. Last question from this side of the hall. Please go ahead. Faisal Waidi from Yemen. My question to Dr. Mohammed Al-Mesfer: can we expect a negotiation between the Houthis and the UAE away from Iran? We heard about such negotiations between Saudi Arabia and Iran. And of late, we see that the Houthis are achieving many advances in the West, and they are at the gates of Shabwa and Ma'rib on the West Coast. I think we've taken enough questions. Now we give each speaker 2-3 minutes to comment. Dr. Mesfer, please. So far as the Russian presence in Syria and whether or not that contradicts the Iranian presence, I think in the beginning the Russians were in agreement with the Iranians. The Iranians were on the ground and the Russians were operating in the skies, and the Russians prepared the ground for the Iranian forces. They were providing air cover for the Iranian units on the ground and providing protection to them. Now, the situation has changed somewhat. The Russians now seem to think that they are the only active an effective force in Syria, and the Iranians should pull back, and this can be understood from Russia's silence vis-à-vis Israeli attacks on Iranian positions. So the Russians are trying to minimize Iran's influence on the ground as much as they can. I think this is somewhat late in the day. The Iranians have managed to get their claws into the different parts of Syria through naturalizing Iranians who speak Arabic, through money, financial investments and things. A lot of these Iranians have become Syrian citizens now. So therefore, Iran's hegemony on Syria, even if this was to be achieved despite Russia's approval, it will take place. Under the rule of Raisi, I think he's strongest president who comes to power because of his relations with Khamenei, the supreme leader, and his linkages to the Revolutionary Guards and the security apparatus and to other centers of power. So therefore, even with the parliament and other state institutions, I think this person now, although he did not get a very high percentage of the vote, but I think he controls all the reins of power, and some Iranian sources think that he is being groomed to replace the supreme leader, and he belongs to the school that there should be zero problems with the neighboring countries, and this should strengthen Iran. I repeat what I said. If you give me a minute or so, please. The more crises increase in the Gulf area, the Gulf investment financially outside Arab countries and Islamic countries, and the more the problems between GCC countries, the more arms purchases we will see, and the more arms purchases we'll see will mean more weakness, not strength. So therefore we see, even with the strong armies and very sophisticated weapon system by Saudi Arabia or the Emirates, they could not achieve much on the ground militarily in Yemen or elsewhere. And in the previous session, there was talk about the root causes of the Gulf, because for me there is only one or two root causes. First, the Qatar's wealth, firstly, and secondly, the political role played by Qatar. As Dr. Rumahi said, some countries can play a role much bigger than their size. I don't think this is true. Qatar, being a small country, but has played a strong role, and this was included in the 13 demands by asking for financial compensation and others. They wanted Qatar to limit its influence outside the region. I hope I've given... Thank you. Dr. Bakir? No, thank you. Dr. First of all, Dr. Bakir, there is no doubt that the Iranian regime is facing a big economic crisis. Today, there were demonstrations in Isfahan, and there are problems about water in Khuzestan. some of these problems are not linked to the sanctions regime. They are more to do with the infrastructure and some structural defects in the Iranian system, which goes back to 40s. If today the sanctions are lifted, the banking system or the tax system or trading system will be attractive to any foreign investor to do that. Total, when they wanted to invest in the North gas fields, they tried the circulation of money with $1,500. They found that the system is really backward. So there are inherent problems, and added to that is the increase in the size of the population, inflation also. The oil revenues constitute more than 85% of Iran's national income, and this constitutes a real dilemma. This is probably the secret of Donald Trump's success when it comes to Iran, because his withdrawal from the negotiations, the Iranians looked at it as a blow to the entire regime, because everybody went for the negotiations, and Trump really, what Trump was a blow to all of them. I agree 100% with our colleague from Iraq. Soleimani is important. Maliki said that killing Soleimani was a killer blow to Iraq itself, and he said that because of his pain. But politically speaking, we see that the first time Abdullahian, the Iranian foreign minister, in August visited Iraq and visited the place where Soleimani was assassinated. There was a time when the Iranian parliament wanted a briefing on Afghanistan, Qa'ani was called to do that, and he is in charge of the Al-Quds brigade. So this is an irony that some political commanders in Iran have certain charisma. With their demise, the picture changes. When it comes to Syria and Russia, there is a problem on the Taifour airbase. You know, the Russians withdrew from that military base, and the Iranians were spreading around it. And it was leaked a few days ago that the Iranians will be withdrawing from this airbase, which is near Hims. In fact, the Iranians were hit more than once by the Israelis in this airbase, and the Russians were informed of that to avoid casualties. What is important that Iranian withdrawal from Taifour has something to do with Iranian political propaganda, because this is close to the so-called Qasem Soleimani road, which goes through Beirut. I doubt very much that Iran will withdraw from this area because of its closeness to Lebanon. Now we take a final round. If you have any question. If not, then we'll give the floor to the three panelists to wrap up. We have only a few minutes left before it's 4 o'clock. There is a question. Is there a question?
نعم. دكتور حسن على الزوم. ما يستند سأعود إليه إن شاء الله بعطيه فرصة. نعم معنا أخ كريم هنا. طيب إذا معنا سؤال واحد ثم أعود إلى الضيوف.
Okay, we have one question, then we go back to our guest. Thank you very much for this. For these presentations. My question to Dr. Mesfer, these two schools of thought, are they complementary to each other or are they contradictory to each other? The school of thought which relies on the region, or the other one which relies more on abroad. In my humble opinion, they complement each other. There is no contradiction between them. The Iranians are present in the Gulf, in the Arab region, not all in the Gulf. This provides them with a strong card in front of the Americans to go back to the days of the Shah and become the policemen of the Gulf. السلام عليكم. We've been hearing all morning and this afternoon too different diagnoses of the Arab and Iranian the Gulf problem. What do we lack? The lack of political will or the ability to work, or is it that your opinions are heard but not listened to? Let's go back to Dr. Mason. If you have any comment, please. هل تسمعنا دكتور روبرت ميسون؟
Yeah, thank you.
Okay.
Yes, I can, yeah.
Yes, go ahead, please.
So I just wanted to pick up on one of the previous points, actually, about the Houthis, and I think it's really about the advancement of them in Yemen. It certainly complicates the issue of diplomacy, but I think we need to look at it in a broader context. That post 2014, there's been a lowering of the oil price, which has affected the budgets of these the GCC states in particular, which is perhaps a driver towards diplomacy. As I've mentioned, we have President Biden now instead of President Trump, which is a factor in diplomacy. There's other states such as China, which have an interest in peace and stability in the region for economic reasons mainly, and the economic crisis in Iran. So this convergence of interests, plus it's supported by Emirati diplomacy and building bridges during the COVID period, especially. So, and its right sizing of its footprint in the region more broadly. So I think that goes some way to answering this final question about what is it which is the issue. I think it's perhaps the interests of these countries are being affected for both domestic and international political reasons, and that's what's the driving factor, in my opinion.
Okay, thank you very much, Robert.
شكرا جزيلا لك روبرت. Now we move to Dr. Mahjoob and Dr. Mesfer. Thank you. I just want to remind us all and confirm what Dr. Abdullah Al-Ghilani has said. I've been repeating this for over a decade now, that the Arabs are in the Gulf also, they are submissive towards Iran, and politically speaking, and which cannot be explained except because of the weakness of Arabs. Iran is a third world country, weakened by its economy, weakened by its ideology, and this has been the same for the last 40 years. Give me one country with an ideological country which was successful. Give me one example. Ideologies never served countries. What is required is to serve the human being, the human factor here, and not the ideology. Iran invested and utilized the Palestinian cause, and also in everybody rushing into the arms of the United States, and also the lack of ability to face up to the West, which made Iran portray itself as the superhero. The Shiites are present in the Lebanon, are there since 1943, since the first constitution established by the French. And now we say Iran has created Hezbollah. Hezbollah came after Amal. Amal was there. Our consciousness, our awareness should change. If we don't change, we'll repeat this narrative, recycling it all the time. And Iran said Iran occupied 4 capitals. These countries fell because regimes were not legitimate. They could not survive. They were despotic regimes. They couldn't protect themselves. They say Iran deposed them. Who is Iran to do that? I said our awareness should be raised. Your opponent becomes strong when you call him strong, and your opponent becomes weak when you deal with him realistically. Thank you, Dr. Al-Mesfer. 2 minutes to close the session, please. I agree with what Dr. Mahjoob has said, that this leadership should change in their thinking. I don't mean a change of regime. They should change the way they think and the way they deal with. They should stop this inner fighting and wars against each other, and also this inner fighting between Sunnis and Shiites. In fact, Iran is embracing all the Shiites and turning Sunnis into Shiites in Syria and Palestine, everywhere. At the same time, some Arab regimes are fighting the Sunnis and consider all of them as terrorists. And now we see what's happening with the Al-Islah in Yemen, whereas the other side, Iran, is embracing the Houthis and strengthening them. As you said, sir, both schools are one in achieving the same objective. The methods differ, but the end is one. So therefore, both regional and international schools of thought have one objective, and that is Iran's hegemony on the region. Thank you very much, our speakers, Dr. Mahjoob, Dr. Robert Mason, Dr. Mohammed Al-Mesfer, and thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for your interaction. We come to the conclusion of this session. We have a 15-minute break. Then we'll come back for the public lecture at 4:15. See you later. Bye.